Hello, it's Adrian here from Arcade Zach, and on today's podcast, I am joined with a real retro gaming legend, John Tobias, the co-creator of Mortal Kombat. Nothing more needs to be said, so guys, sit back and enjoy a really interesting story about one of the most important video games ever made.
Welcome to Arcade Attack. A retro gaming podcast for up to 4 players.
So, welcome back to the Arcade Attack podcast. I have got a really special guest today. It's a real pleasure, a real honour to talk to one of the co-founders of one of the most important games of all time, Mortal Kombat. I'm talking about John Tobias. Thank you so much for your time today, sir.
Hi, thanks for having me.
The pleasure is all mine, trust me. We are going to talk a lot about Mortal Kombat, but I'd love to start, if that's all right, John, from the beginning, really, about maybe your earliest memories of gaming. Is there any particular games you loved growing up playing?
My earliest memories were playing games like Pong.
Yeah.
And I know that when I was younger, my father liked playing games, video games. And so he purchased out here, we had a store called Sears, and they had a unit. It was like called the Telecade, maybe, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And it was like a combination Pong. Maybe it had Breakout and then like a racing game. With very crude graphics, but that was one of my earliest memories playing games, and I was probably, 6 or 7 years old, maybe. And then after that, I remember seeing games, at amusement centers. So I used to play a lot of pinball machines when I could. It was a little tough for me because I was fairly short, so it was hard to see over the play field.
Yeah.
But then I remember video games. Started showing up in the arcades. Space Invaders, I think, was one of the first I remember playing. I think there was like a Western style, I don't remember the name of the game, but it was like a Western style shooting game where you were 2 cowboys kind of facing off,
Nice.
on the street. That was one of my earliest games. But I remember playing those things and being, enamored with, the mechanics of the peripherals that were available. I thought that was an important part of it, just sort of the feel of the coin op buttons and joysticks and things.
Yeah.
So those are my earliest memories. And then of course we eventually got an Atari 2600. And then that, was kind of, everything took off from there. And then the arcade boom kind of happened in the late 70s, early 80s for me. And so I was kind of in the middle of that. And that was a ton of fun.
Stuff. Yeah, great stuff. No, I agree. Arcades, the feel of the atmosphere, it's a bit of a shame it's not really around as much today, isn't it? But
right.
Yeah, well, obviously.
Well, that was a big part of the experience back then because there was no internet, so obviously you couldn't play your friends from home. So the only place you could play someone one-on-one was, kind of at the arcade, in that environment. And, as I got a little older, I think in my teen years, the arcade games sort of became, a bit more complex. And I remember watching just sort of the progression of the quality of the on-screen graphics, went from kind of, single color visuals to multiple colors. And, I remember having a reaction to that. And for some reason, I think Defender was one of the first games that I remember seeing that displayed graphics in color. I'm not sure if that was one of the, the first one, but it was one of the first that I remember having an impact on me. And the sprites, the pixel sprites were fairly crude, but they were in color, and that to me, that was incredible. And so just every little, advance in technology, I remember being hyper conscious of. And that was, like I say, in the arcade, that was always a big thing for me.
No, great stuff. Obviously, it sounds like your games had a big influence on your life growing up. But I'd love to know how you got into the industry. What was your big break, and what was your first game you ever worked on?
Sure. So I I joined Williams Electronics in 1989, and Williams Electronics eventually became Midway. I had just I was just about to graduate from college, and I think I was 19 at the time, and a friend of mine who had graduated a year ahead of me, a guy by the name of John Vogel, he started working at Williams, and then there was an opening for a new artist, and so he called me up and asked if I was interested. And back then, there wasn't much you could learn in terms of a curriculum, in school, because computer graphics were fairly new, and so most of what I knew was kind of self-taught. I had an Apple IIc at home with a program called Dazzle Draw, and I did a lot of pixel pushing on that. And then when I was in high school, I got my hands on a Commodore Amiga and worked on that for a couple of years. And so I was familiar with creating, pixel graphics. And at the time, I was actually working as a comic book illustrator. And I had been doing that for a couple of years. And so for me, it was, back then I was lucky to be, to be an artist and also have had an opportunity to get my hands on, on a computer and work with graphics in that way.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a rare thing back then. So, I applied for the job and was hired. And then the first game I worked on was a game called Smash TV.
Brilliant game.
Right. And that was sort of kind of like a sequel to Robotron, which was an arcade game that had come out earlier, but they both kind of featured the sort of the dual joystick mechanic, the kind of the top down,
yep.
With the sort of the enemies kind of cruising around the screen and you controlling your player and being able to shoot, in all 8 directions. So that was the first game that I worked on. And that was a great experience for me because, I met a guy by the name of Mark Trammell, and Mark had a long history doing, console product. Like I think he worked, maybe he worked for Activision, but he had done a few games on the Atari 2600 that coincidentally I had played when I was a kid, and so having a chance to work with him was huge for me. And then, of course, when I was hired in the department, I got to work with a guy by the name of Eugene Jarvis, who is, a luminary in the industry and just was coincidentally, the creator of Defender, which was a game that I tried to play when I was younger. It was fairly complicated, but, I was aware of that product and obviously Robotron and all those things. And so I got, I was very fortunate that I was able to kind of, have my introduction into the industry through those guys. I learned a lot from them and I was lucky that they kind of let me just sort of do my thing. They were, Eugene obviously had been in the industry for years at that point, but was great about listening to my ideas and, was fun to collaborate with, and same thing with Mark. And Smash TV was a lot of fun to work with. That was a great game to sort of cut my teeth on.
We actually really love Smash TV at Arcade South. It's just a good fun game, isn't it? And
it was fantastic.
It just loses. And Eugene Jarvis, we spoke to him before the text interview. What a gentleman! He's a proper legend. So it sounds like you can certainly do worse, have worse mentors. That's for sure.
Right. Yeah. No, it was a lot of fun. It was being involved in Williams at that point was a lot of fun. And they were sort of on a rebound because they had weathered sort of the arcade crash that I think happened maybe in the late 80s, and so they had just produced a game called Narc that had done pretty well for them, and so they were looking at kind of rebuilding their video game department, and so I kind of came in at the beginnings of that.
Brilliant. Smash TV is very closely, I think, inspired by Running Man, which actually is an Arnold Schwarzenegger one. I think a really good film, actually, and really actually quite good timing because I'm sure you heard, John, that I think Arnie or Terminator is going to be in one of the new characters in Mortal Kombat 11, I believe. Is that right? So I think
I saw that. Yeah, no, it's funny because it's Yeah, I mean, Smash TV was inspired by Running Man and a few other things. It was actually
Yeah.
just on Smash TV real quick. There were at least here in America, there was a TV show called American Gladiators that was
Yeah.
popular at the time, and so that kind of was the initial. It was like the idea of, oh, these guys are on TV and they're being put through these trials, that kind of a thing. But of course, Running Man obviously was also played a part in it as well. But yeah, it's interesting that Terminator showing up in the latest MK only because of when I was working in the the video game department at Williams, another team was doing a Terminator arcade game, and that utilized digitized graphics that we were sort of known for back then. And so it's kind of cool to see that there's like this odd connection between Terminator and Mortal Kombat that has always kind of existed for me, at least because of being involved in the video game department at Williams at the time, and the fact that while we were working on Mortal Kombat, or maybe just starting Mortal Kombat, they were working on the Terminator 2 game, which was an important game for our department because it was a big license, and it was important for us that it performed well. I didn't actually work on the game; it was a different team, but their success was huge. Actually, every video game that we put out in the department back then was important. It was important for us for it to succeed, so because it just kind of fueled our ability to kind of create subsequent games.
Good stuff. I mean, bit of a crazy question, but if you could work on a new sort of game, an Arnie-based game, is there a lot of good films? Is there any sort of film you'd love to sort of base a character on, or make a whole film on? Maybe, I don't know, like a Terminator game or whatever, or
a game. I would do Conan the Barbarian.
Oh, yes.
That would rule.
That would rule. I love that answer.
Or maybe Commando.
Could you imagine? That'd be amazing, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Again, another game, and we Total Carnage. Okay, another top game. I love the look and feel of it. How was that your next game then after Smash TV?
Right. Yeah. So after Smash TV, Mark and I wanted to do a follow up, and so that's what became Total Carnage. And Total Carnage didn't perform as well as Smash TV had, probably for a lot of reasons. But that was a lot of fun to work with, and it was, I think for me, my experience in Total Carnage, it was fun to work on. But one of my frustrations back then was that, Williams was known for digitized graphics. That's what they had done that on a game called Narc. Mm. And then I remember when we were working on Total Carnage, they were probably working on the Terminator 2 arcade game at the time, and that featured digitized graphics as well. And we had software that was being kind of developed, to support the production of digitized sprites. And Smash TV and Total Carnage, because the characters were so small, the digitization didn't really lend itself to either of those products. And I remember on Smash TV, particularly when I joined, the idea was that it was going to be digitized. And once I started working with the graphics, I kind of made the choice, hey, I think we're better off doing this all by hand. And so, Mark and Eugene were on board with that. And so, all the art in that game was hand drawn and animated by myself. And there was another artist named Tim Coman who worked on it as well. But Total Carnage was kind of the same thing, where it was all kind of hand drawn pixels. And as much as I loved doing that work, to me, it felt like, wow, if we could feature larger characters with digitized sprites, that would be a lot of fun to work with. And so, subsequent to Total Carnage, that's where kind of Mortal Kombat was an attraction for me, because, it was going to be a one-on-one fighter, and the idea of working with the digitized sprites was something that I thought, was something that I wanted to do.
Ah, great stuff. I'd love to know, actually, it's a bit of a personal question, John, but do you remember the first time you ever met Ed? I mean, Ed Boon. He was obviously, you and him made Mortal Kombat. Did you get on straight away? Was there, was there any other game ideas? Was he in the same department as you? I'd love to know how you sort of got introduced.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. So what I remember is Ed had programmed pinball machines for a number of years before I had joined Midway. And when shortly after I was hired, I don't remember how long afterwards, might have been a few months or so, but Ed had come down to join the video game department. And so back at Williams Electronics, I'll paint the picture for you. There was a big factory that manufactured pinball machines. And in the back of that factory were the offices where the software was developed for both the pinball machines and the video game department. And we were on the first floor, and on the second floor was the pinball group. And so they had a much larger department, and their the production of pinball games was in my view was a lot more complicated because there was the mechanics and the engineering involved with the playfields and such. But Ed was programming the software for pinball machines, and I guess maybe wanted to come down and join the video game department. And so I met him because he had moved into the office next door to the office that I shared with John Vogel. And the first time I remember meeting Ed was I remember he moved into the office and he was playing his music really loud. And I remember him coming over to our office to hear how loud his music was, to know whether he was playing it too loud or not. That's the first time I remember meeting him. And I remember him kind of knocking on the door and coming in and going, "Hey, is that too loud?" And then kind of going back and lowering the volume. But that's what I remember when I remember meeting him the first time. And then, Ed was always such a friendly, jovial guy. I mean, it's always joking around. Everybody got along with him very well, because of that. But he and, the rest of the video game department, we had all kind of hung out together, on occasion and such. And, like I said, Ed was a big joker, so he was a lot of fun to be around. Yeah. But he had worked on, he was working on a football game at the time. And I was probably working on Smash TV, or maybe just finishing Smash TV, when he had come down.
Great stuff. When did you start thinking? When did you start talking to Ed and I guess your managers and whatnot about, we want to make Mortal Kombat a new game? And was there? I'd love to know actually. Was there any other sort of games you suggested or thought up at the planning stage that kind of got threw away, and you sort of said no, Mortal Kombat's the one to go for?
Right. So the way I remember that happening is, I had mentioned that when I was working on Total Carnage, there was a little bit of frustration on my part, just in terms of the limitations of that style of product, and so. Sort of the inception of Mortal Kombat happened. Ed and I had a conversation about doing a one-on-one fighting game, and when I think back at that, at that conversation and what kind of led up to it for me was, I was trying to get away from the tiny character sprites, and I wanted to do something with large characters on screen, because I thought, especially seeing what the guys were doing on the Terminator arcade game, I thought large characters on screen really helps take advantage of the digitized look. And so Ed and I in conversation kind of talked about the idea of a one-on-one fighter. And I remember thinking back then, not of Street Fighter 2, which I don't remember being out at the time that we had this initial conversation. Because I remember thinking about Karate Champ, which was a game that I played when I was in high school. It was an arcade, kind of a one-on-one fighting game, very crude, but fun to play, I thought. And I thought, wow, a game like that with digitized graphics, that would be awesome. Yeah. And so Ed and I had that conversation, and we were both still working on our prior game. So I was in the middle of Total Carnage, and he was working on, I think, a sequel to the football game he had worked on. Super High Impact was the game that I believe he was working on at the time. And so we were just having conversations about it, and we weren't ready to kind of start working on it straight away. We had to kind of wait until both of our games were completed. But somewhere between that conversation and us completing our two games, Street Fighter 2 was released in the arcade. I do remember that. And that actually had a positive impact on us, because I think for us, it kind of helped justify, to our management, that a one-on-one fighting game was a viable product. That Street Fighter 2 was doing great in the arcades. And so I think that was great for us, because it just kind of showed that, that maybe this was kind of a good thing to pursue. So, but those are sort of the early conversations that we had. And then that kind of led into a bunch of other things for us. that led to I'm trying to think the early days there was so here's one part of the equation was was that we thought tying our game to a license might help in terms of getting a green light from management, and that was because we thought that because of the Terminator 2 game was released and obviously was successful, it was a big film, and so we thought, wow, if we could tie ourselves to a license, it might help bolster our chances of approval. And so our licensing director, a guy by the name of Roger Sharp, had come to us with a license for a film called Universal Soldier.
Oh, yes.
Which starred Jean-Claude Van Damme and Dolph Lundgren. And so I remember Ed and I thought we didn't want to do a Universal Soldier license, but we thought, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we could get a martial artist, like a martial artist actor, involved in the game. And so that's where our pursuit of Jean-Claude Van Damme kind of started. So we had asked Roger if he would, if he could contact Jean-Claude Van Damme and see if he would be interested in, collaborating with us on an arcade fighting game. And that's how the Jean-Claude Van Damme thing kind of started.
That's a great story. I mean, did you ever meet Jean-Claude Van Damme?
No, we didn't. Roger, I think, had talked to maybe, his agents, and it didn't get very far. I think at that point, Ed and I were coming closer to the completion of our games. Management was on board, by that point for the idea of a fighting game. Street Fighter 2 was released. And so, and for whatever reason, the deal didn't work out. And, but our management, they were so high on the concept that, that they, let us do it anyway. And we were so psyched. I think even by that point, we had already started working on the idea of the characters and, what the plot of the fiction was going to be. And Jean-Claude was the way he was going to fit into it was he was just going to play one of the characters in this fictional universe that we were creating. And either he was going to be himself or just, star in the game as one of these fictional characters.
That's amazing. I mean, the irony is he did turn up in a video game a few years later in Street Fighter 2, the movie, the game. How great. It's a funny world, isn't it, John?
Yeah. Oh, that was very odd. And it was a digitized game to boot. I mean, that was very sort of full circle, in terms of Van Damme and us and just the idea of him being involved with a fighting game. That was funny watching that kind of transpire.
I'd love to, a bit of a hypothetical question, but imagine if you did make the Universal Soldier game. I'm pretty sure we wouldn't be talking about Universal Soldier 11 right now.
Right.
Do you ever think where your life might be if you thought, I'm just going to make the Universal Soldier game? Not a bad film, but it could have been a completely different ball game. Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know that game would have been a fighting game. More likely, it would have been sort of a side-scrolling beat 'em up. I don't know. I mean, obviously, Universal Soldier was no Terminator 2. So, in terms of the power behind the license, it was, not quite as popular, I think, as Terminator 2 was, obviously. And certainly Van Damme was no Arnold Schwarzenegger at the time.
Yeah.
So, who knows? But I'm glad that we continued down our path. And not having a license tied to it really freed us up to kind of do whatever we wanted with it. So
I think brilliant. I think that's it's the right decision, isn't it? Let's be honest.
Yeah.
I'd love to know though, because Mortal Kombat. I think there's been a lot of it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but lots of inspiration from lots of other films. I see Bloodsport in there as well. Big Trouble in Little China. Was there a lot of that in there where you got a lot of inspiration from big movies at the time? And what do you reckon?
Yeah, well, so the opportunity to do a fighting game and a digitized one was great. But for me, I was growing up a huge kung fu film junkie, and so I remember when when we were sort of concocting the story and coming up with the characters, I thought to myself, I'm going to take all of these influences, that I had growing up, and throw it all at what Mortal Kombat became. And so the funny thing about Mortal Kombat is that it truly is sort of this conglomeration of all this stuff that influenced me growing up, and all this stuff that influenced Ed growing up. And really, when you look at the totality of what Mortal Kombat was, it really was sort of this conglomeration of Ed and I, and all these influences that that we had. And that game could only have resulted from the two of us, meeting at that time, at that place and time, and creating that game. Because there is, it's really hard to express yourself as an artist in an arcade game, certainly, but it really was just sort of a product of who we were and what the things that we had experienced growing up. And it's funny because, I remember even back then, when I would get asked, "Hey, what influenced you?" And there was a lot of different things, and there's kind of the obvious ones, obviously Enter the Dragon, Bloodsport, Big Trouble in Little China. You can see little bits and pieces of those things that I had sort of experienced as a high schooler. But there were other films, I think, that had even more of a direct influence that I kind of would sort of just jumble up. Like I would say, kung fu movies, and really what it was there was a production company called Shaw Brothers that from out of Hong Kong that had done a lot of martial arts films, maybe in the late 70s, early 80s, that I had been exposed to on television. When I was younger, there were sort of these movie houses in downtown Chicago that in my early years in high school I would go to, and they would play these sort of triple feature kung fu movies. And those films played a large part in a lot of what had sort of influenced us. And but it's funny because I had done a few other interviews, and I had started to look up these old films that I had seen, and the names of the movies had changed over the years. But you can still find them today. Like I know Amazon Prime here in America, they have a whole library of the Shaw Brothers films. And I found a few of the ones that I had seen growing up. 36 Chambers was one of them. The Five Venoms was another film, I think, that influenced us. There was an actor that had appeared in those movies. I knew him as Gordon Liu. I'm not sure what his actual, his proper Chinese name translates to, but Gordon Liu, when we came up with Liu Kang, I got Liu from Gordon Liu. But he was the star of, there was a movie called 36 Chambers, and he was sort of the lead character in that film. And that sort of was the idea of Liu Kang being a proper Shaolin monk came from 36 Chambers. And there was a movie called Clan of the White Lotus. The Liu Kang character was a member of the White Lotus Society, which I kind of pulled that from Clan of the White Lotus. There was an old sort of wise kung fu master. He was an evil guy from Clan of the White Lotus. Yeah. That was sort of the inception of Shang Tsung. Actually came from that character. There's a little bit of Lo Pan from Big Trouble in Little China as well. But what I'm getting at here is just that Mortal Kombat really was just sort of a mashup of all these things that I had experienced growing up, and so we really just threw the kitchen sink at Mortal Kombat. And there's some Star Wars in there in terms of how the story had transpired through the subsequent sequels from Mortal Kombat. But it really was sort of this love letter to all this stuff that that I was a fan of growing up.
It worked,
and Ed as well. Obviously.
It worked, didn't it? It's an incredible. I mean, do you sometimes have to pinch yourself how big the series has become? It's one of the biggest games of all time. It revitalized arcades. It stood out from the crowd. It must be amazing looking back now. Is that fair, or is it? But at the time, did you know you were making something so special? Or was it just a sort of another job for you?
Yeah. Well, no. I mean, when we were working on the first game, it was a lot of fun to work on, only because the atmosphere in our video game department at the time was they really cut us loose. I mean, there was very little direction from anybody other than Ed and I. So there was no one from marketing. Management wasn't telling us how to make a game. It was just, okay, go do your fighting game. And then the rest was up to Ed, myself, and John Vogel worked on it, and Dan Forden, who did our audio. And they just cut us loose, and we just did what we thought we wanted to see in a game. And, I think the one thing about us at the time was we were young enough that, we were the demographic, who were going to play this game. And so I thought that, we had probably a good sense of what would resonate with the players. But, when I think when it blew up, of course, we didn't expect it to do as well as it did. We knew that we were creating a fun game. It was fun to work on. It was fun to play. I think, I remember thinking at the time, my only expectation was that we would manufacture enough units to get it out on test and hopefully, produce a few thousand games, which is what we had done on Smash TV. And I thought that game was a success. And so I thought, it'd be great if we can at least do that. But while we were working on Mortal Kombat, Terminator 2 was released, and that was like a huge game for our department. And so I think they just sort of opened the door to the idea that, wow, we can do something that, that hits critical mass, in the arcade market. Like I said, in the first game, our expectations were fairly tempered, but it was great to kind of just see it blow up. No one predicted that. It was just, I think all we knew was, make a game that's fun to play, and we just kind of, worked by our instincts, and then fortunately, it, worked out for us.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, John, you worked in a small team to make the first game. It was only a few of you, wasn't it? You and Ed and a few other people, but how did you fit all the work in? I've got you down here. You developed the stories, the themes, the settings, I've got here. You made the complete roster of characters. I mean, that must have been a lot of work. I don't know how you did it.
Well, we didn't sleep much. I remember that. And so, I mean, it's funny because today there's a lot of controversy around the work habits of folks who work in our industry. And back then it was similar. But for us, though, it was like there was never anybody cracking a whip. It was just, we were young and we had a lot of energy and we enjoyed what we were doing. And so it really was, you just pour your heart into your work effort. And so, I mean, that's how all that work got done. It was just, we didn't sleep much, and we worked, 14, 16, 18-hour days. I remember sometimes we wouldn't sleep, when it came time to kind of release, the game into the arcade. I remember leading up to our first test, us kind of working incredible hours. And, Ed was an amazing workhorse. I mean, he just, I remember sometimes he would bring a duffel bag with his clothes and he just wouldn't go home. So that was the type of energy that we had, and the passion that we had for what we were doing. And, fortunately, I think with games back then, is the scope of the product wasn't as large as they are today, so that, it really only took a handful of people to create something. But, you had to have passion, and you had to have energy, and you had to enjoy what you were doing, to kind of get the work done. I mean, that's all I can say about how we got that done. It was just, it really was just us being passionate about the work that we were doing.
Brilliant. I'd love to ask this question, John. It doesn't have to be necessarily about the first Mortal Kombat, it could be any of the sequels you worked on. But did you ever work on any characters that you created, you designed possibly, but they never made it into the game for one reason or other? And I'd love to know, is there any characters you can sort of reveal that, were close to being in the game but never made it?
I mean, all the stuff is kind of out there already, but on the first game, because so one thing about the first game was that we were working on a compressed schedule. And so everything that we did was sort of utilitarian. So I didn't do a whole lot of concept art. It was all very, I would do a few sketches and have ideas in terms of what the costume pieces were going to be that we were going to have to gather. Let me think. The first game, there were maybe a few characters that I had sketched out and written stories for that we ended up not using. But there was very little of it. The second game as well, I think maybe I had done some color sketches for characters that we, knew right away we weren't going to use. The only version of a character that I can think of that we actually went so far as videotaping the actor producing, the sprites for getting it in the game and then deciding, wow, this is not going to work, was we did a version of Jax for Mortal Kombat 2. And my original sketch for him had him sort of in this yellow kung fu outfit that I made it yellow and black. It was sort of a call out to Bruce Lee from Game of Death. I remember looking at him on screen with Ed, and I was not happy with sort of the way that the yellow, sort of the way it looked on screen. There was the creases in the clothing to me weren't working. And I just wanted to redesign the character. And so Ed and I decided to kind of scrap that version of Jax. And we sort of went back to the drawing board. I did another marker sketch of him, of the Jax that you see seeing in Mortal Kombat. And we reshot the actor John Parrish in the new costume.
Yeah.
And so that was, I think, a good call on our part. But that was the only time I think that we had gone that far and ended up scrapping what we did. It would have been much more difficult to do that on the first game, only because I mentioned, we had a compressed schedule, so we were just, firing on all cylinders on that game, and we threw away very little. There was a lot that we had done in the studio with the actors that we ended up not using.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah, like I remember we had shot intros for the characters back then, which I don't know that anybody had done yet. You see character intros in fighting games today where they kind of jump out and say a few things and do a few moves, prior to the fight starting. And so back then we shot the actors kind of walking out onto the stage and then, performing a move and getting ready to fight. But we ended up not having, the memory to include those sprites in the game itself. So we ended up scrapping that stuff.
Oh, good stuff. I mean, Mortal Kombat, it got a lot of attention when it came out, for the gore, for the graphics, like the lifelike, the real actors on the screen. But I think sometimes it's forgotten for bringing quite a few other innovations like juggling, fatalities. I mean, it's not just a Street Fighter clone at all. It pushed the genre in really interesting and quite ambitious directions. I mean, what part of Mortal Kombat are you most proud of, if you don't mind me asking, John?
I think when I look back at the first game in particular, what I'm most proud of is just sort of the process the process to create the game. I think is, obviously the way that it resonated in popular culture is, I'm very proud of that. But I think what it shows to me is that especially today, because games are so expensive to produce, there's so many cooks in the kitchen that the end result, it's very rare that it is an expression of the folks working on it, because there's such a huge number of people working on it. And when you get marketing involved and you start to become overly concerned with whether the game is going to be a commercial success or not, it kind of starts to limit the risks that you might take with the choices that you make. And so Mortal Kombat really was, as I mentioned earlier, it was a product of us, and it was, what we thought would resonate and the things that influenced us. And so it was as organic as you can get in terms of putting a game out, players finding it and enjoying it, and it, the success of it truly was sort of, organic in a sense. It was, when we, especially, like when we tested the game, it was a black arcade cabinet that we rolled into an arcade and turned it on, and players found it, and enjoyed it and kept playing it. And, so that, I think, says a lot about, that I think even games today, when, the folks making it have to be passionate about the work that they're doing, from top down. And it was the same back then. And so I'm just, I'm happy about the process, and it was as difficult as it was to create the game. I think in part it was the success of it that allows us to look back on it favorably. So
Oh, great stuff. Actually, I'd love to know, John, did you ever sneak into any arcades and sort of watch people play your game and even maybe compete against the punters and get people?
Yeah.
So, do you ever do that? If ever find yourself seeing what everyone's thinking of your game in the arcades?
Yeah, sure. Well, we did that all the time. I mean, on Smash TV, that was my first experience with that, where we had, what we would do is we would test the game for a number of weeks prior to its release, and back then that's how we would make changes. You'd find out what resonated with the players and what may not work, and you'd change some things here and there. And so when we would put the game out on test, typically we would do a weekend test at first. And it was important for us to kind of be there and watch the players. And so we did that a lot. And fortunately, especially I think for Ed and I, we were young enough that we could blend in with the crowd, so they didn't know who we were. And so we would stand around and watch them play. And that was always a great experience. And you'd learn, as I mentioned, you'd learn what worked and what didn't. And, one of the hard truths about testing games back then was that you learned right away. It felt to me, at least, like we learned right away whether we were going to succeed or not. And I remember a saying, I don't know if it came from Eugene Jarvis or Mark Tamel, but somebody had a saying of the first player who drops a quarter into the game, if he doesn't drop a second quarter in the game, you're dead.
Wow.
And I don't know whether that was true or not, but I remember having that impression. Like, that's how crucial that first, and it typically for us was a Friday evening. That first Friday evening watching players and their behavior with the game was crucial for us, and certainly the earnings were as well. But Smash TV, I remember having a positive. That first weekend test did really well, and so we knew that that game was sort of on the right path. And the same thing with Mortal Kombat. Our first weekend test, we did incredible, and I remember when we had rolled the first game in, the first MK cabinet into, it was an arcade called Times Square on the north side of Chicago. And I remember we turned it on, and there was a Street Fighter II machine there that had, this huge crowd of players around it. And so we were scared shitless. I mean, we didn't know whether anybody would play our game, and so I remember standing there watching it. Ed and I were there, and probably some other folks from Midway were there as well, because it was always a big event when your game did your first weekend test. And I remember watching the first guy kind of come over, first player, and play the game, and then going over and pulling over another guy from the Street Fighter crowd,
Nice.
And slowly they migrated over to Mortal Kombat, and they stayed, and it was that way all weekend. I remember by the end of that weekend we had a huge crowd of players around MK, and the Street Fighter II crowd had sort of dwindled. And so we were extremely excited. Like, we thought, wow, we've got something special here. And so that was a great result for our first weekend test. But staying there and watching the players play was a big part of our decision-making process in terms of, what we did that we thought worked and what we needed to change a little bit. And I don't know that there was much that we changed on Mortal Kombat. I think that we had kind of kept a lot of what we had, and I think watching their reactions to the fatalities, I think, was important for us. That was a big part of our decision-making process with fatalities. Like, we knew that it got a great reaction from the players, and one thing that I think was important for us was any positive reaction you got from the players was a good thing. It didn't matter what it was that was in the game. If they reacted positively to it, it was thumbs up. And so we just knew, okay, push more on that. So
I love that.
We did a lot of watching the game on location.
Brilliant. I love that story. Thank you, John. Just on Street Fighter really quickly, are you a fan of the game? And is there a character in Street Fighter you like playing with? Or is that a bit of a touchy subject?
Yeah, no, not at all. We were huge fans of Street Fighter 2. It was a great game. It was fun to play. I think Ryu and Ken were my go-to guys on Street Fighter 2. One thing I will say about Street Fighter 2 and as it relates to Mortal Kombat, with Mortal Kombat, one thing I do remember, that was one of our mantras, at least mine, in terms of the visuals, was that when I looked at Street Fighter, it was more, and when we looked at Street Fighter, it wasn't so much to mimic what they did. It was almost to learn what to do differently. And so Mortal Kombat was, from the graphics, everything that we did was more to differentiate, because our game was going to be a one-on-one fighter, and so there's the inherent similarities in terms of two characters beating each other up. We can't escape that. But in terms of the visual approach, I think that with Mortal Kombat, the digitized technique and the fact that we had a compressed schedule, sort of, and the fact that we wanted to differentiate from Street Fighter led us to sort of the raw digitized nature of what you see in the first Mortal Kombat game. There was very little pixel touch up that we had done, with the sprites in that game, and we had almost, we made a conscious choice to just sort of let the raw pixel graphics live as they are, and so we felt that would help sort of differentiate us from Street Fighter and kind of sort of carve out our own, visual qualities, as a game itself. And so what you see in Mortal Kombat was not accident. It was, those were conscious choices that we had sort of made. And that was a result of Street Fighter in a lot of ways. It was looking at Street Fighter and seeing what they did. And early on in MK, I remember almost thinking, oh, maybe we can rotoscope the game.
Oh wow, yeah.
And, we would digitize the characters and I would just draw over them. But that kind of, first, we didn't have the time to do it, and second, using the raw digitized graphics really helped differentiate us, our visual qualities from Street Fighter. And so, anyway, I just thought that might be a good thing to sort of point out.
Yeah, no, really interesting. Again, your answer, I assume, might change every week, every few weeks or so. But do you have a particular favorite character and even fatality move within the Mortal Kombat universe?
Yeah, I know I get asked that, and I think my answers change all the time. I love all of them. I mean, obviously the initial roster is my favorite.
Yeah,
there were subsequent characters, obviously, that I thought that we did that worked well. But the first game sort of was firing on all cylinders in terms of the fiction of the game. I talked a little bit in the past. I've talked about. When I look back on that initial roster and the use of character archetypes in terms of who they were and using that to sort of tell story in a way that we couldn't, because we didn't have obviously cutscenes back then. There wasn't a whole lot of exposition that we can tell, but we thought that, by making a character the distinct hero and this guy a distinct sidekick and all those things, would help us sort of convey story without telling actual, story exposition. And so because of that, I think the initial roster tends to be my favorite. Goro obviously is one of my favorite because visually I think he kind of stands out, sort of specifically just sort of the iconic nature of him, and people see him and know he's from Mortal Kombat.
Yeah.
Same thing with Sub-Zero and Scorpion. I think are as popular today as they were back then, and so I think that they are kind of my favorite. Raiden obviously is one of my favorites. So anyway, I'm not giving you a good answer because they're all my favorites, but I don't know. Fatality wise, maybe Sub-Zero's the head with the spine.
Oh, it's
is
brilliant.
one of my favorites. Kano's heart rip is a cool one.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not going to give you a
that's
good
all right.
answer.
No, that's no problem. It's amazing. Mortal Kombat, when it came out, though, and the sequels as well, it got a lot of attention in the media. I'm talking newspapers, and it wasn't all good. They were saying this is too violent, there's too much blood.
Sure.
What do you think about that? Did you look back and sort of think, maybe we went a bit too far, or in a weird way, did it almost help push the sort of your name out a bit more?
Well, I think it helped us. I mean, I think it helped certainly, catapult us in terms of the, the pop culture side of things. I mean, I think that, Mortal Kombat became a household name because of its, infamous place in pop culture history, because of the violent nature of the game. And so that, in an odd way, all of the attention that we got, I think, ended up benefiting us. and somebody in our department, it was either Eugene Jarvis, I don't remember. Somebody I remember saying, "Hey, all publicity is good publicity." The funny thing is that Ed and I didn't set out to be controversial. We didn't, the idea of fatalities didn't start from a place of, "Hey, let's do this because it's gory and it's gonna gather that kind of attention from the masses." We didn't. That was never our intention. It really was. It really did start out with, I remember Ed at the end of a match had a hang up because there was it was sort of the end of a match and there was nothing to do, and that was sort of the birth of the idea of, "Hey, let's do this secret thing at the end of a match." And the idea of making it gory just sort of was a byproduct of that. And I remember the reactions from people who played the game in the office when we did, the first fatality was Johnny Cage punching his own head off. And it just was, the reactions we got from people were so visceral that, everyone enjoyed it so much that we thought, wow, let's keep doing this. That's kind of how it started, as opposed to us thinking, that we were going to do it just sort of, to gather attention. That's not how fatalities were born for us. That was the end result of it, obviously, I think, was that, the violent nature of it, I think, is what sort of, propped us up as this sort of bad boy arcade game. Anyway, I think when it was going on, the first game, came out and was released in the arcades. I think it really didn't get mass media attention until the home product was released. A year or so later. And by that time we were already deep in Mortal Kombat 2.
Of course. And I think the SNES version had no blood. I think the Mega Drive version, it was very easy to get the blood on.
Right.
And I think the Mega Drive version sold a lot more. And I think it really helps. Quite an interesting rivalry between the two ports, actually, isn't there?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there was everyone has told kind of the story of what had transpired back then. But I mean, I think it showed that. One interesting thing about arcade games back then was the port, the home version ports of those games were crucial. And the accuracy in terms of the translation was very important to the player. So, the idea when you did a home port wasn't, what's different. It was how accurate is it to the arcade version of the game. And if you deviated from it, players didn't like it. And so, a game as popular as Mortal Kombat, it was important for the player that it be, as accurate of a port, as possible. And so, taking out the fatalities, which was a primary piece of the game, was going to rub the players the wrong way. And so, the reaction to the SNES and the Genesis version of the game, I think, kind of demonstrated that.
Great stuff. I mean, Mortal Kombat 2, it's probably my personal favourite in the whole series, if I'm being honest. When you first started working on Mortal Kombat 2, did you feel a lot of pressure? Were you given the same freedom again, or how did that sort of pan out?
Yeah, we were given the same freedom. I mean, other than just, the directive to create a sequel, no one told us how to do that. But I remember, it's kind of a funny story. I remember after Mortal Kombat 1, Ed and I wanted to do something else. And I remember we wanted to do a Star Wars game. I remember that, us having that conversation. And that didn't get very far because, the first Mortal Kombat game was performing so well in the arcades that, I remember having a conversation, Ed and I had a conversation with our general manager at the time, a guy by the name of Ken Fidesna. And Ed and I had conveyed to him that we wanted to do a Star Wars game. And I remember his reaction was, Star Wars, you guys are going to do Mortal Kombat 2. And so that was fine with us. We had enjoyed working on the first game so much. the opportunity to do a sequel, we thought was a great thing. And for me in particular, I remember being excited because the first game, there was sort of this fiction that we told, and it was just sort of the beginnings of it. And so we were sort of excited to be able to expand on it. And there were things about the process, just sort of the development process, that we knew that we could improve. And so that was exciting because we knew that the second game was going to look better. Because I think there were maybe some improvements in the hardware that were going to benefit us, in terms of the graphic quality that we were going to be able to take advantage of. We were going to have more memory so we could have more characters, and then we were going to have more time as well. And so, all those things sort of equated to sort of the idea that we were going to be able to do a bigger, better version of the first game. And so it was exciting, more so than being having any sense of pressure. I mean, obviously there was a little bit of pressure to replicate the success of the first one, but as I mentioned, because of the improvements that we were going to be able to make, there was maybe a sense of confidence, I think, that we had with the sequel, that we knew that it was going to be a better game, and whether it was going to perform as well as the first one, again, you never know until you release it. But certainly the success of the home version of the game, and all the media attention that it had gathered, really meant that the sequel was going to have a lot of eyes on it. But I don't ever remember feeling pressure. More just excitement and passion, and we were having so much fun working on it, that it was more excitement than pressure.
Good stuff. Kind of linked to that, and I mean, Noob Saibot, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correct. It's just amazing. I love the idea of your surname and Ed's surname mixed around. How did that come about? Did you think of it? Was it Ed? What happened?
I remember that being Ed's idea. So it's funny because on the first game and the second game, when we would do the palette swaps with the ninjas, at one point I remember giving Ed just a rainbow selection of color choices, we had purple ones, green ones, all kinds of colors. And I think Reptile in particular was probably, the inception of that started with Ed, I'm sure. Ed was the idea that there was all this hidden stuff in the game. That was all Ed. He would start that process, and then I would just sort of follow along. So Noob Saibot in particular was, Ed did that, came up with the idea of the backward name and everything. And then when I found out about it, it was just on my plate to sort of make up some fiction for the character, to help fit him into the universe. But most of that hidden stuff, Rain, Noob Saibot, Ermac, his history was a little bit different, but all that stuff sort of would start with Ed kind of bearing that into the game. And then we would just sort of, come up with fiction to kind of help meld them into the story and the larger fiction of the rest of the game. But Noob Saibot was, that was Ed's idea. And it was funny because it wasn't until years later that we had actually given those characters sort of a proper introduction into the game. I think maybe it was Mortal Kombat Trilogy or maybe Mortal Kombat 3 where we had actually written some fiction for those characters. And it really wasn't until I had already left Midway, and I think it was the much later games where they had really introduced those characters, properly in terms of how they fit into the larger fiction. But it's cool seeing them still around today. Like MK11, there's Noob Saibots in MK11. So who would have thought, that this sort of character who began as an afterthought on Ed's part, would become this sort of, one of the key characters in the franchise. It's fun to watch that sort of happen.
Oh, it's brilliant. I think that's another reason why people like Mortal Kombat and the sequels. There was all those hidden moves and hidden characters. Right. And, it was brilliant, actually. And I think you kind of mentioned it earlier, John, but that sort of freedom to kind of do what you want adds to that, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah,
no, absolutely. It's funny because Mortal Kombat had... it's interesting because especially with the first game, the fiction of the game was sort of, it was a lot of it was in the players' heads. There was very little exposition to the story that we could tell. We did it in the attract mode of the games, that we would tell, there would be a short paragraph of each character and how they fit into the larger theme of the game itself. And I think because of that, the players were put in a position where they knew what the character looked like. They knew, the high level fiction of the character, and how those characters fit into the world and how they related to the other characters. We implied that by who the characters were and what their brief stories were, but a lot of the detail the players sort of made up in their heads. And so because of that, I think it gave the game sort of this mythological quality where the players had this world in their heads that really we just sort of insinuated, but they sort of filled in the blanks. And again, it gave it sort of this mythological quality, and the fact that we were burying secret moves in the game really just added to to that whole mystique. And especially with the first game where there was no internet, and so when somebody would discover something that was buried in the game as a secret, it really was just sort of word of mouth. And especially in Chicago where we tested the games, we could almost see the migration of rumors and and all the secret moves and stuff would happen. Yeah. We would test a game on the north side of the city initially, and then when the game would also test on another part of the city, you could see sort of the secret moves and all this stuff just sort of by word of mouth travel through the city, and that was really cool to see happen. That was a whole different side of gaming that doesn't exist today, obviously because of the internet. But the idea of secret moves playing a pivotal role in what really makes up Mortal Kombat started with that first game and started in that environment, and lives today kind of in a different way, obviously because of the advent of the internet and how people share the stuff that they find. But MK today is even when you watch a game like Mortal Kombat and who the characters are in the roster, how things get revealed. I mean, they really play on that mystique that was birthed, with the first game, 25 years ago, but they still kind of play on that. I think Ed, will tease players with who the next player is going to be or who the next characters are going to be in the roster and all those things. It's fun to see that still lives today.
Yeah.
But really, it truly is amazing.
No, great stuff. Really quickly, actually, one way that the story of Mortal Kombat is, another way it's been brought to fans is through the movies. Are you actually a fan of the Mortal Kombat films, and were you involved in any of those back in the day?
Sure. The initial movie, well, first off, Ed and I and the team, we were always so busy working on the next iteration of the game that, when the game sort of blew up in pop culture and, they started making toys and, there was all this, the ancillary products that were a result of the popularity of the game. All this stuff was happening, and then certainly when the film was in production, we were busy working on Mortal Kombat 3. By that time, and so we had a little bit of involvement only in that we were sent the screenplay and we were able to make some comments here and there, but really not all that much. Ed and I got to visit the set a couple of times. And had a few we had a number of conversations with the producers, and then I only really had a couple of conversations with Paul Anderson, who was the director of the first film. But I was a fan of the first one, obviously, and I know Larry Kasanoff, who's the producer. He loves to tell a story that Midway hated the film, but I know Ed and I didn't have too much of a negative reaction. I think we had seen it. A rough cut of the film, and it was, there wasn't color correction, the audio was off, and I think that there may have been some people at Midway who were exposed to that version of the film and had a negative reaction. I remember Ed and I being very excited about it, and having a sense of you never really know whether something's going to be a success until until it comes out. But I was a fan of the first one. I think we thought that they had serviced the property well. They had learned, I think, during the initial pre-production portions of the development of the movie. I think they learned quickly not to deviate too far from the arcade the arcade origin of it. I remember at one point seeing a version of Scorpion that looked nothing like Scorpion from the game, and I think they had done some focus testing on it, and they learned also as well, not to do that. That fans and players would react negatively to it. And so, it was exciting, to kind of see how that happened. And, one thing I'll say about that first game, though, is, I mentioned that when we did the first and the second game, our ability to kind of tell any real story exposition was incredibly limited in the arcade games. When you look at a game like MK11, where there's just hours of story exposition that can be told in cutscene and dialogue and all those things, we just didn't have that.
Yeah.
And so we had to rely on sort of, character archetypes and just raw sort of the thematic quality of the story that we were telling, just by the nature of who the characters were and what the high level fiction was. We kind of had to rely on that stuff. I think that the first film, when it was released, there was such a desire to see the fiction that they had been sort of telling themselves in just sort of in their heads. They had this idea of the story that was being told in the game that we weren't able to tell in the game itself. And so the excitement behind that, I think that first film, was just being able to see that stuff represented, so cinematically on film, I think was exciting for the players. And I think in large part had to do with the success of that first film was just sort of this buildup, this desire to see, these characters that everyone loves so much, represented that way, I think was huge. Whereas today, I know they're working on there's a new film that's in early production. And I don't know that sense is going to be there, for the film, that same desire that existed back then, only because when you play MK11, the cinematics are so amazing, and the fiction that they tell is so, they're just through dialogue and through the process of playing the game, they're able to unfold so much, story exposition that, and they do it in such an amazing way that I don't know that, when we see the stuff being told cinematically on film, well, I just played through MK11 and it was amazing. So what are you guys going to do, in the film that I haven't seen already? So it's going to be interesting. Those guys have their work cut out for them in representing the game in a way that is true to the story, and in a way that the players expect. Because I don't think that the novelty of seeing it on film is quite what it was 25 years ago.
No, I get that. I think you make a good point, definitely. Bit of another tough question. Is there a particular Mortal Kombat title, any game in the series that you think, this is what I would class as the definitive game? It's where everything came together properly, and it's, not necessarily your favourite, but which one do you think sort of defined the series for you?
Well, obviously the first game, in terms of laying the groundwork, but I think MK2, only because it was such a good, it like encapsulated what we had done in the first game, but did it in a way that it was just sort of us cut loose, and I think the mechanics of the gameplay, I think Ed was just on his game, for that particular one. And so I would say MK2 for me, I think is the best sort of, it was the we expanded on the story, and I think it fulfilled a lot of what the players were looking for in a sequel. And so I think, if we had failed with that second game, I don't know that MK3 or the film or all those other things would have happened. Because MK would have maybe been dismissed as a fad if we had failed on that sequel.
Like I said earlier, Mortal Kombat 2 was just brilliant. I just thought I love the first Mortal Kombat, but it just seemed to improve in all areas, truthfully. So you made it. I'm going to listen to you 100%. A bit of a personal question, but why did you leave Midway? Because you're on a good thing, obviously. Mortal Kombat was getting bigger and bigger. Do you mind me asking why you decided to leave Midway Games?
No, not at all. So it's interesting. So I think, when I was involved with Mortal Kombat and watching it sort of grow and explode, at that stage, I think when I left I was like 30 years old, and it was myself and a group of guys who I had worked with. The desire to start our own development studio and try our hand at that, I think was a big part of the reason why. And of course, it's difficult to leave something like a Mortal Kombat. By the time we had left, I think the arcade industry itself was already starting to wane. And so, working in the Chicago office at Midway, we were still producing arcade games. That was still our thing. And I had sort of branched off with the team to do there was a Mortal Kombat Mythologies, the Sub-Zero game that had come out, and that was a straight-to-home version of the game. But we were also producing MK4 at the time. And, as I mentioned, the arcade industry itself was starting to kind of wind down. And so, at that stage, it didn't really matter what you did in the arcade because, your success was sort of tempered by, what the industry as a whole was doing. And so I was sort of watching that kind of transpire. And my frustrations as a developer, I think, was when we started to turn our attention to the home product, in the late 90s there, it was new for us because, we were used to working with smaller teams on the arcade games, and the home product required us it was sort of a different animal for us. And sort of the process of developing those home games for us was a bit of a struggle. And so, while that wasn't a direct, reason for why I left, I mean, I think that played a part of it. And, when we thought about, wow, if we were to walk away, what are the chances that we're able to kind of, strike a development deal with somebody? And one thing that I had learned from talking to other people who had worked, in the console industry was, when the new consoles are kind of coming out, that's when there's a lot of money. This is the world back then. Yeah. But that's when there's a lot of money from publishers floating around, and they're looking for people to develop on their new platforms. And so we knew that there was going to be a short window of opportunity for us to be able to strike a development deal. And unfortunately for us, we were working on there was, Ed and those guys had kind of branched off, and they were doing an arcade game called The Grid. We were still also working on, there was a Mortal Kombat home game called Special Forces that we were sort of in the middle of working on that had its own development issues. But, unfortunately, that game was going to realize some delays, and our window of opportunity for getting a development deal, we thought it's going to come and go. And so that's why we left at the moment that we left, was because, the Xbox, was coming out. There was a PlayStation 2 that was coming out. And so we thought, wow, if we're going to form a studio, get a development deal, it's going to be now. And that's why we left at that particular moment. And it was tough to leave Mortal Kombat. I mean, obviously, the fourth game had come out, I think did well in the arcade given the condition of the industry. But we were all kind of taking maybe a little bit of a break from Mortal Kombat as a fighting game. But I remember when I left, I still felt that, Mortal Kombat was going to be a forever property. It's because of its place in pop culture. You can have a game or two that maybe don't perform so well, but all you got to do is kind of dust it off, create a proper game. And if it's good, the players will come. No one's going to forget about, Mortal Kombat. And so I thought that just like anything else that lives in pop culture, whether it's Spider-Man or Batman or, the Marvel properties, you can do a shitty movie, but, no one's going to give up on Spider-Man or Batman or any of those things. And I thought Mortal Kombat kind of, I felt at the time that it can be one of those things where it just lives forever. But, because of that, I think it made it difficult to walk away from. But that's kind of, again, that's why we left, I think, at that particular moment.
No, I appreciate the answer there, John, 100%. So the game you worked on, hopefully I'm going to pronounce it right, is Tao Feng, Fist of the Lotus. I mean, right. I haven't played it truthfully. I didn't have an Xbox back then, but just reading about it, it does sound. It looks ambitious. It's damage effects, interactive environments. I mean that. Right. I like the idea of bringing new stuff to the table. How exciting was it to work on that particular title?
So that's interesting. So when we formed our studio and started to go out and look for a development deal, a fighting game was not our first choice. You know, the last thing we wanted to do was get put in a position where the expectation was for us to replicate the success, you know, of Mortal Kombat. And, you know, me in particular, I thought, you know, Mortal Kombat is such a product of the right, you know, game at the right time, you know, I just didn't want to have the pressure on our studio to have to replicate that success. But the one thing that we learned real quickly was everybody was only interested in working with us if it was a fighting game. And so we got pigeonholed into doing a fighting game. And so Microsoft, you know, came knocking on our door with a development deal, provided we would do a fighting game. And so, so we bit at that opportunity. And so despite, you know, being fearful of the expectations, you know, we just sort of launched into, okay, well, if we're going to do a fighting game on one of these next generation systems, what can we do to help differentiate? What can we do to help, you know, make the game unique in its own way? And so that's where sort of the, you know, the visual damage to the characters, the idea of, you know, your player taking damage during the course of a fight, and all those things. I think there may have been games that had done it in the past, but as far as I know, at that particular time, you know, we hadn't done that on MK. I don't even know that. I guess maybe they had started working on, I don't remember the name of the first MK game. Was it Deadly Alliance maybe? Was being worked on at the time. So I don't know that game had character damage. Maybe it did. But so that was sort of the inception of Tao Feng. You know, in hindsight, I think the fact that I themed it, you know, there was sort of these, you know, the Asian, you know, mystical qualities to the theme of the game, which is what we had done in Mortal Kombat. You know, obviously, you know, my history with that and my love for kung fu movies just sort of found its way into Tao Feng as well. And so that's why, you know, and one thing I will say about Tao Feng is, you know, the game, I think, suffered mainly because of the mechanics of play weren't quite where they needed to be. And, you know, one thing about games, especially something like a fighting game where, you know, the mechanics are so crucial to it. You know, if you misfire, you know, and any portion of that side of the game, the rest of it sort of doesn't matter. You know, the audio quality, the fiction of the game, the visual quality, none of that stuff matters if the play mechanics aren't there. And I think that's where, you know, Tao Feng slipped up was, you know, we could have used, you know, a few more months of testing of playing and tuning up in terms of the quality of the you know, the core mechanics of the game. And so we probably released it a little bit earlier than we should have. But it was a lot of fun working on that game. You know, we built our studio. I worked with there were a lot of talented people who came out of that studio who are still in the industry today, working on huge, you know, games. And when I look back at that collection of people, you know, it was a good group of people. We made a lot of friends, and a lot of people sort of cut their teeth in the industry on that game. So despite, I think, and the game actually performed decently for us, but you know, but I think, you know, despite not being able to replicate obviously the success of Mortal Kombat, I think, you know, when I look back at that game, for me at least, it was a fairly positive experience.
Yeah, great. Actually, you said you didn't really want to do a fighting game. What were your games that you were desperate? Was it back on the sort of Star Wars game, or was there a genre you were desperate to get into?
We were thinking about maybe a racing game. You know, I mean, it was just sort of, we were just beating around, you know, a bunch of different ideas, and it was more about, you know, we had been talking to a few different publishers, and they had ideas for the types of things they wanted, but it always kept finding itself back to a fighting game. But, you know, for some reason, I remember a racing game being one of them.
Oh, great stuff.
Yeah, but we never really got, you know, very far with the concepts of those things. Did you ever start work on that Star Wars game? Because there is rumors that on the internet that you started work on a bit. Was it literally just ideas? No. So it's coincidentally, when I was with Studio Gigante and we were working on Tao Feng, there was a period of time where we were putting together game proposals, and one of the one of the concepts we put together was a Star Wars fighting game that we had proposed to LucasArts, and we created a prototype using the engine. We had done a wrestling game. Was one of the products that we had produced, and using that engine, which I thought was a fantastic engine in terms of our ability to do graphics and animation, we used that engine to create a prototype for a Star Wars game. That I think that's what you're probably referring to. That someone put a video on the internet about it, so there was. I think we did a prototype, and it was Anakin fighting Darth Maul, maybe.
Brilliant.
And it actually, I thought at the time, looked great. The funny thing was, we proposed that to LucasArts, and so they were hemming and hawing about whether they wanted to pursue it. And unfortunately, we had closed our studio, and then after that, they had come back to us and said, "Hey, remember that prototype you guys put together? We might want to pursue that." And we were like, "Oh, sorry."
Oh man,
we've moved on.
That's a shame, John, because I think that would have been a great game. I'm going to check out the video.
It looked cool. Yeah, who knows what it would have turned out like. And it's funny because that particular prototype we had reskinned. We reskinned as a Kill Bill game. That I thought looked pretty cool. And so I don't know if anybody's got. I certainly don't have any old videos of that, but that actually looked pretty cool too. We had done rather than Anakin Skywalker or Darth Maul, it was Uma Thurman's character fighting the crazy 88s, in that environment.
Oh, sounds amazing.
It looked incredible. But that one ended up not happening either.
Such a shame. I'd love to know, John, are you still in the video game industry? And if so, what sort of projects and games are you currently involved in?
I am. So several years ago, I started working for Zynga. And Zynga, at that time, they produced a lot of Facebook games. They were trying to find their way into mobile at the time. And so for me, I had worked on console product for a lot of years. And then prior to that, I'd worked on, arcade games for a lot of years. And so that was, when I got involved at Zynga, that was sort of the beginning of mobile games. And so Mark Turmel, who I had worked with, on Smash TV all those years ago, started working at Zynga's San Diego studio. And so he had called me and was trying to get me interested in coming out and joining him at the San Diego studio. And what interested me about it was I knew nothing about mobile game development. I knew nothing about social gaming. But one thing I knew was that it seemed to sort of open the door to a sort of a new class of players. My mom was playing video games now, and my sister, and all these other people who never touched a video game were now attracted to games. And so for me, it was what attracted me to join Zynga was just the idea of exploring what is social gaming, what is mobile gaming, why are all of a sudden people who never thought about playing games, why are they playing games? Yeah. And so when I joined Zynga, it was more, I thought, hey, this is a great place to learn about this. And so I was involved at, with social and mobile gaming for several years at Zynga. Yeah. And learned a lot about mobile games and social games. And, when you look at the industry in general, the mobile game industry is massive. And the demographics have changed so wildly. With the introduction of mobile gaming, whereas we're so focused on console gaming and the male demographic, and console gaming is still in a lot of respects still stuck in that living in that world, whereas mobile games you have to address this whole other audience, and so for me it was an interesting transition, and there were and there are similarities between mobile gaming and the arcade game market that we used to work in. Yeah. Only in that the player's interaction with the game is done on a micro level. Like back in the arcade days, it was a quarter at a time. And in mobile gaming, especially the free to play market, it really is. It's very similar in terms of how you how you work with the player, how you get the player interested, and how you get them to keep playing. And it's funny because there's I think folks who come from the console industry look at the mobile game business, especially the free-to-play side, in a negative light. But there's a lot of similarities to what we do in mobile games. When you compare it to what we had done in the arcade games, the choices you make are, as a developer and a designer, are very similar. So that's the cool thing about working, I think, in mobile, is that, we're solving a lot of those same problems that we had in the, way back in the arcade days.
Okay. Yeah. Great answer.
Yeah. So I was at Zynga for several years. I left Zynga several months back, started a new company with a fellow by the name of Paul Stapley, who's an old industry vet. And so we're just sort of in the middle of raising funding and developing an engine and finding publishers to work with and doing all those things. So we're, like I say, kind of smack in the middle of that.
Oh, brilliant. Well, it's been a real pleasure, John, talking to you today, especially because I know you're so busy. Just a couple really quick questions, and I'll let you get back to work. If you found yourself inside Mortal Kombat universe in a crazy situation, if you could choose a fighter to work alongside you or protect you even, who would you choose? Who would you put the most trust in out of any Mortal Kombat character?
Sheesh. Liu Kang.
Yeah.
Liu Kang, the original one, because he's like a true hero. He would make good choices. He wouldn't stab you in the back.
Yeah. Great answer.
Yeah.
And I asked this question to all my guests, and it's a bit of a crazy one, but if you could share a few drinks with any video game character in any game, who would you choose and why?
A drink? I don't know. Maybe Mario.
Good. Yeah.
Only because it would be fun to see him drunk.
Yeah, I agree.
He might say some things that he would never say if he were not drunk. So.
Yeah, that's a brilliant. No, I'll join you there 100% with that drink. Yeah. Look, John, it's been a real pleasure, and I love hearing the stories. And Mortal Kombat is a real favourite of ours, and just taking the time to talk to us, it actually does mean so much to us. So thank you so much.
Great, yeah, thank you, and thanks for. I love arcade games, and I love folks who live on in terms of, or who help that the old industry kind of live on in terms of nostalgia and stuff. And I think you guys do a great job at that. So it's
you're a real gentleman.
A lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. We really hope you enjoyed it. If you want to get in touch regarding this week's episode or anything else, you can tweet us at Arcade Attack UK, at Keith Barlow 82, and at Arcade_Adriano. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/Arcade Attack UK. Please check out our website at arcadeattack.co.uk for lots of retro gaming goodness, interviews, reviews, features, top 10s, etc. And you can also find all our previous podcasts there. Our podcasts are available to stream from the website and are available to download for free from Stitcher, Podbean and iTunes, where you can also leave us a review and a rating, which we would really